Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. This is Season 10, Episode 11, and I'm your host, Dean Jones. I've really been looking forward to talking with today's guest, and they did not disappoint. My guest, Regula Ysewijn, is an internationally acclaimed food writer and author of books about food culture. Her works include Cafe Culture about the cafés of Belgium, Pride of Pudding about British puddings, a variety of dishes, both savory and sweet, traditional to the British culture, and the official Downton Abbey Christmas book, as well as the magnificent British baking book, and more. I can't emphasize enough how much I love her books. Regula makes magical books that are fun history, glorious cooking, and wonderful to look at. Everything a book and cookbook lover could want. I'll take you now to my conversation with author, historian, Regula Ysewijn. Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. Today I'm very honored to be having historical food writer Regula Ysewijn, who is an internationally acclaimed food writer and author of books about food culture, like the history of British food. She consults for companies like the National Trust and most recently the TV series Downton Abbey. Regula, welcome to the podcast.
So glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
For our listeners who may not be familiar with your work, can you tell us about where you grew up?
I grew up in Antwerp, which is in the Dutch language region of Belgium in the Low Countries in Europe.
And that's where you live now?
And that's where I still live now, here in Antwerp. And it's very rainy here. It's just past Easter. And I can't wait for better weather and nice sunny spells and flowers everywhere.
What are your first memories of food and cooking?
My first food memory was my first food memory dates back a really long while because I was still almost like going out of my baby years. We were in Switzerland. I think I was about 2 years old, so very young. And I can remember that my mum gave me a strawberry and I tasted it. And I must confess, I've never ever tasted a strawberry again like that first strawberry. And then in that moment, tasting that strawberry is an entire memory encapsulated because my mum gave me the strawberry and I tasted it. And while I was tasting it, I looked at my father, who was backlit because he was sitting in front of a window in our B&B room. And in the background, outside of that window, a really large ship was passing, and it made this noise like woo, and the big cloud came out of the chimney. And that whole memory is encapsulated into my brain because of that. The memory of the taste of that first strawberry, which I think is extraordinary. And only about 3 years ago, I said to my mom and dad, can I just put this past you? Did this actually happen? And they were like, yeah, this did actually happen. We were staying by this big lake and there was this big steamer boat. And yeah, this definitely happened. So it was not something that I came up with. It actually happened.
That's a lovely food memory. In 2010, you started your blog, which led to your becoming a freelance writer. From 2014 to 2016, you wrote for the British digital magazine Fish on Friday and pieces for The Guardian and several other publications. What kind of work were you doing during this time? And did you realize that was this during the time where you realized, I want to be a food writer, I want to write about food?
It just happened gradually. So I was working as a graphic designer at an agency in Antwerp. And I had the feeling that I could not completely be creative in the way I wanted to be creative. So I started photographing again because I went to art school when I was a child and a young adult, and I started photographing again and started writing again. And then I thought, what am I going to do with these photos, and what am I going to do with all of this writing that I had put with those photos? And at that time, there was this new platform online called Blogger, where you could put your photos and then you could put your captions underneath the photos. And I thought that was really handy because I wasn't going to print them because the early years of digital photography. So it's like, let's keep them just, digital. And without even realizing, I had started a blog And it was mostly about food and mostly about British food, because so many people already knew I was a foodie always thought it was quite exceptional that I was also really obsessed with Britain, and they couldn't really match the two, like being a foodie and loving Britain. They were all like very there's this prejudice about British people saying like in Britain people don't eat well, it's all fried stuff. And I was like, and of course I had, without knowing, I had started a food blog, and I started meeting other people who had food blogs, and I was like, oh my gosh, so I have a food blog. I had no idea. But then this whole community opened. I mean, this was way back in 2010. Food blogging was a very new thing. It was very niche, and it was very much still a very personal thing. It was not like people weren't monetizing their blogs at that point. People weren't earning anything from it. It was just people had a passion and they wanted to write about that, share their passion. And we would just spend our times reading each other's blogs, like we would read each other's newsletters or Substacks or Instagram posts. We would read each other's posts, we would comment on those, and we would learn from each other. And it was this just wonderful world of food-loving people sharing their experiences and sharing their knowledge. And it was all just really brilliant. But apparently I was doing something right, because after a while I started getting assignments to do writing, and because they also liked my photography, I was allowed to do my own photography for the pieces as well. My first was a column about British food history for the Great British Food magazine. Did 6 issues, I think, for 6 issues. And then I got contacted by a publisher saying, have you, we love your blog, but have you ever thought about a book? And it was like, oh, well, I mean, being a graphic designer, of course, I've always dreamed about having being able to design your own book and having your own book. So they said, like, you've got carte blanche, you can decide what you're going to write about. We'll see you again in 6 months with a proposal. And it all went from there. So I did propose them a book 6 months later, which turned into Pride and Pudding, the history of British pudding, savory and sweet, which I worked on full time, because I quit my job at that point, because I was like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this book. I'm going to do some freelance photography and writing jobs on the side, and I'm going to write this book. And I worked on it for 3 years, so the historical research and translating those historical recipes to workable recipes for today's cooks, and photographing them so that people could actually see what history looks like. And yeah, that's how it all happened, basically.
Now, in 2016, you also published your book, Belgian Cafe Culture. This book is a nostalgic look at the most beautiful traditional cafes in Belgium and the stories they have to tell. How did you come to write this book? Can you talk about some of your favorite cafes that are featured?
So in 2016, when Pride and Pudding came out, that was a very weird year, because that was also the year that the referendum came back in Britain with a vote to leave the EU. And because I was an Anglophile, and my entire writing career was completely focused and dedicated to British cuisine, that kind of, it hit me really hard. And it got me thinking that even though I had been looking at Britain in my entire life, even though I was living in Belgium, and I was neglecting my own culture, and I didn't want to look at my own culture because I didn't think it was that much interesting, of course, because I had this passion for Britain. And at that time, I started thinking, maybe it's time for me to start forging a way home. And I got into I was at that point, I had 6 years of culinary school behind me, in evening school, because I always thought when I started writing about food, I should get some kind of education that's that so that I actually know how things work if I'm going to write about it. And the last course I did was beer sommelier, and specifically Belgian beer sommelier. So that already started that pathway home. And then when I saw the message on Facebook from a friend of mine that said, we have this cafe in a town called Mechelen, which is going to close because the owners want more revenue from the property, and they're going to close it. And this was a cafe, which is essentially a pub, because it's not a coffee place. So many people think because it's called cafe that it's a coffee place, but it's a pub, it's a bar, a Belgian cafe. And people were really upset that the bar was being threatened with closure, because a Belgian cafe is a social institution. It's a place where young people, old people, students, people who are retired, young, old, and rich people, people who are working at the harbor, cleaning, everyone comes together in this Belgian cafe. And this is a place, this is like a crossroads, people meet there. This is like one of the only places where a lot of these people will still sit on one table and have a conversation. So it is socially, it's the glue of our society. So many people also have clubs in the cafes. They'll have like a knitting club, or they'll have like a billiard club, or a book club in the cafe. So many things happen there. And then that bar was threatened with closure, and I was like, well, I feel like I need to go there. I need to hear what these regulars there what they have to say, and what this place means to them. So I went there, and I took my camera, and I took pictures of the evening, and I talked to people, and I realized for the first time that this was a very special place. This was an institution, and I needed to basically photograph it for future generations and write about it for future generations before everything is disappeared, and before everything is turned into Starbucks and McDonald's and all that kind of, same old kind of thing. And the next day I emailed the publisher, and I said, I have this book I want to propose to you, and I designed it with my husband, who is the designer of all my books. And I went there, and the book got published a year later. So, not even a year later, in the same year, in 2016. So it's it's amazing, because for me it was like that first steps home. And then my most recent book, Dark Rye and Honey Cake, really did get me home, which is a very powerful thing. It's a very emotional thing to come home. And then that cafe, of course, that I talked about, that was the start of the cafe book, that sadly closed. And a couple of the other cafes in my book already closed as well. And there's a big problem with these cafes, that they are not getting succession. There's no grandchild taking over these cafes, because they don't produce an income anymore. So it's mostly the very old traditional cafes are run by elderly landlords and ladies, who are like grandmothers and aunties to the people they serve, which is a beautiful thing. But it's also very sad, because once they are gone, then usually the cafes will remain closed as well. And there's no system in place to protect those interiors, which are often incredibly beautiful. We've got Art Nouveau, Art Deco interiors, sometimes even like 60s, and they are incredible. And it's really, if you find yourself in Belgium one time, and you should try and search out the old traditional Belgian cafes, because they are quite extraordinary.
I've always wanted to go to Belgium. My wife and I, we want to go to Europe, and I think that's one of the first places that I like to go. I know that Charlie Chaplin spent his last days in Belgium, and it just sounds like a magical place to me. And these cafes, we don't really have anything like it here. I mean, the Starbuckization of the United States has basically eliminated most things like that, and something like that just draws to my heart. It seems so sad to see these institutions going away. That's horrible.
Yeah, I think it's always people, especially young people, they always want the new and shiny things. And a lot of them are, of course, embracing Starbucks with all their new fancy kind of coffees with strange combinations. And I mean, I think there should be a place for both. But it's the problem is with humans, I find it's not like they can exist. It's not like they can coexist. It's always one taking over from the other. And when I was in the US for the first time in my life a couple of years ago, I was so amazed by how many Starbucks chains there were in like even one street or one block, how many there were. And now in London as well, there's so many of those chain coffee houses that it's so sad to see the independent ones go out of business. It's the same with bookstores, really, isn't it? It's the same with bookstores. It's the same with actual physical stores everywhere. I find, I mean, we still have shopping streets full of shops. Most of them aren't, of course, independent anymore. There's usually chain stores, but still, we still have shops. But of course, the buying online, and we have to reconnect with real life. And I think that's why books are a great thing, because you can never get the same feeling from a PDF or a Kindle than what you can get from an actual book. It's the romantic feeling of holding it and having the book. And like, if you want to have a coffee and you go to a place that has been there for 50 years, having that added value. I mean, I think we have to look for that little bit extra that is special and try and just nourish that and keep that alive before we lose it all.
I have such fond memories of cafes and pubs and privately owned coffee houses. And I remember just sitting in a coffee house, when I was younger, and I just would draw all day and drink coffee. And we don't really see that much. You don't feel like you want to stay in a Starbucks. It feels like it's very fast moving. You want to get out of there. And they do that on purpose. They make it so that it's not comfortable. Whereas in a cafe or a pub, you can sit and nurse a pint or a cup of coffee, and you could draw without being interrupted, or you could meet a friend and talk with a friend and stay and talk for hours, which I feel like that's sadly lacking in today's culture, which is a pity.
It is a pity. Yeah, we have this thing which is like a living room cafes, which was something that happened because women stayed home sometimes from work, and then the men would go out to work in the factory, and the women would create a cafe in the front room of their house. So you would actually visit their house. You would feel like you were sitting in their living room. So it felt very homely. And I mean, a lot of these old cafe landladies told me that even like the young people today still come to their place because they're allowed from their parents, when they go out for the first time on their own to have their first beer, they're allowed to go to this old landlady's cafe because they'll know that the old landlady will keep an eye out. She will not like let them have the most heavy Belgian beer. She will go like, okay, you can have a lager and you can try it out. And she will like let the parents know, like, okay, so they each had their 2 lagers and now they're on their way home. So it's like a social structure that these places have. It's warm. It's not cold and impersonal like those big chain things.
Is Belgium taking expatriates from America? My wife and I might have to live there. Depending on how the next election goes, we may have to get over there. Maybe we could open a cafe/library.
Oh yes, absolutely. We have one of those here in Antwerp, which is fantastic. It's called Luddites. It's very fitting, isn't it?
I like that. I'm gonna have to visit that when I get there. I really want to visit so badly. In 2016, you mentioned the book Pride and Pudding, which was your first book. And then in 2019, you published the National Trust Book of Puddings, which I've had a chance to read because my library carries all your books. I like this book very much. I really enjoyed the variety of historic puddings that you wrote about. What attracted you to this topic specifically?
Well, when I was thinking about my first book proposal, which turned into Pride and Pudding, I realized very quickly that British puddings are something very special. Puddings really are the pride of British cuisine, hence the title, Pride and Pudding. And also because I learned I taught myself English reading Jane Austen, so it's kind of a little bit of a thing to my past as well. And the puddings that are quintessentially British, like those steamed and boiled puddings, those are puddings that other cultures had as well. We have them in the Low Countries, but they went out of fashion here pretty quickly. And in Britain, people really took hold of these puddings, and they really cultivated them. There became more of a variety of recipes of different puddings. And even in the 1600s, we know from a diary entry from a French visitor that puddings were considered uniquely British, because he said, "Blessed be who invented puddings." I mean, this is an incredible paragraph in this diary that really shows that he understood that puddings were truly a British thing, and that only the British can really create these puddings in the best way. And so from early on, Britain was already known for these puddings, and they started having cookbooks with entirely focused on puddings, and it was such a big part of culture. So I really wanted to devote an entire book to it. And it's like Pride and Pudding is a very, very, very thick book. It's almost 400 pages. But I felt my work wasn't done, and it kind of bugged me. And then the National Trust contacted me saying, because of my Pride and Pudding, if I wanted to do the National Trust Book of Puddings for them. And this gave me the opportunity to almost finish my work on British puddings, because that gave me the opportunity to look at the retro puddings, like the vintage puddings of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 80s, while Pride and Pudding really does stop at the beginning of the 20th century. So I was able to finish that journey, which I found really nice, and also found like a compliment to be asked to write the National Trust of Puddings as a Belgian woman. So I'm really glad that you are able to get those books in your local library.
We have a great selection. I'm very proud of it. I really love British puddings, and I like a lot of the steamed puddings. It really makes me irritated when people will make, they'll make jokes about stuff. Like, everybody likes to talk, oh, haha, spotted dick. But like I always say, you laugh at the name and everything, but it's really actually quite a nice dessert. And if you can get past the name, it's really lovely. And I really enjoyed it quite a bit. And it's something that I would eventually like to make for my family. And there's so many other great puddings. I can't remember, what is the one that has the lemon baked in it? There's one that has a whole lemon inside it. And that's just a wonder.
Sussex pond pudding.
Yeah, and that just sounds magical to me. What are some of your favorite puddings that you wrote about in this book?
Absolutely love Christmas pudding or plum pudding, because it has such a rich history, and it's interesting because it also tells the history or the story about how we perceive sweet things and how we eat, and when we eat savory and sweet. For example, people always say today that Christmas pudding behind a Christmas meal is way too heavy, and they don't understand why people eat such a heavy pudding, because of course it's full of currants and lots of candied fruits, and so it is quite heavy on the stomach. So why eat that behind after a big Christmas meal? Well, it's because it wasn't supposed to be a dessert. Pudding is not always a dessert. I mean, all desserts are puddings, but not all puddings are desserts.
Right.
So while today we always think sweet things belong at the end of the meal, in the past this was not so. That only changed in the mid 19th century, because before that people would have buffet style, so they could have sweet things, savory things, fish and vegetables, meat. They could have everything on one table, and they would each course choose what they wanted to eat. So if you had a sweet tooth, you could have sweet dishes in every course, for example. But at a certain time, people started to change the way they wanted to eat and went from this buffet style to a style where the food was presented to them and the chef could decide what dishes would be paired together. He would decide, okay, we'll have this asparagus with this salmon, and they would be presented by footmen to the people eating, and they could only choose that. And that's also the time when we start getting celebrity chefs in Britain. Then they start publishing cookbooks. And because of that, they don't want anyone else deciding what to eat with what. So that's one of the reasons the dining style changed. And that's the reason why plum pudding started to go towards the back of the meal, while actually plum pudding or Christmas pudding was always eaten alongside roast beef or roast mutton, alongside the main meat, the main course. It was a side dish with that. It's like what we would do with, for example, some kind of jam served with game meats, that kind of sweet touch to the meat. So it was served together with the meat. And in poorer families, they would actually have things like Yorkshire pudding, or dripping pudding, as it was called before it was connected to Yorkshire. And they would have that kind of pudding before the meal to fill up so they could stretch the meat for longer. And if there was some Yorkshire pudding left over, they could have it for dessert, maybe with some honey. But the whole idea of having puddings for pudding, so for dessert at the back of the meal, is a fairly recent thing in the bigger scheme of things. And that's why we are confused today that Christmas pudding or plum pudding is so heavy to eat behind all of these dishes that you have at Christmas. You're supposed to have it with your meat. And it's very good. And I hope everyone will try it. It's very good. It's also incredibly fantastic if you have a slice of plum pudding or Christmas pudding and you fry it in a lot of butter. That's fantastic. It's so
amazing.
good. It is really good. And another pudding that I think is absolutely glorious is the Bakewell pudding. And the recipe in my book, Pride and Pudding, is actually one of the oldest recipes for that pudding, when it was still called sweetmeat pudding, because of course the Bakewell pudding did exist years before it started to be named Bakewell pudding. It was a sweetmeat pudding, and it exists with a layer of puff pastry, and then we have sweetmeats, which are candied fruits, mostly strips of orange and lemon peel, and a little bit of raspberry jam. And then there's a mixture on top of that with egg yolks, and butter and apricot kernels, which used to be bitter almonds, but we can't use those anymore because they are poisonous, to create that kind of beautiful almondy, marzipan-y scent and flavor. And that goes on top of that and is baked, and then it looks basically like a cow pad when it comes out of the oven. Unfortunately, I think it looks glorious, but some people have compared it to cow pads. It looks very rustic. Let us say that it looks very rustic, but the scent that comes from that pudding is just absolutely glorious. It goes into your nostrils and into your brain, and it creates this party over there, which is amazing. And it's fantastic because if you make that pudding, you can taste history. You can really taste what people ate in the 18th century, because that was when this pudding was really popular in the 18th century. And all the puddings, oh my God, I love so many puddings. I mean, I love black pudding because I've got memories of that, eating that even here in Belgium, because so many cultures have blood sausage or black pudding, because of course that is the idea of pudding, is that it was created to use up every bit of the animal. I mean, the puddings are so as they are, like haggis puddings made in stomachs and sausages made in intestines, because centuries ago, before we had kitchens, before we had pots and pans and just one big cauldron, people also wanted to do some cooking. People always have wanted to do cooking. So they used those intestines because they were like, we can't throw anything away from an animal. They were much more clever than we were, that's the idea. And they used those intestines and they stuffed it with like the pieces of offal, and then they combined it with herbs, and then those herbs tasted sweet to them because they hadn't even tasted sugar. So to them, like more marjoram and oregano and savory, those herbs tasted sweet to them. So if we taste the haggis today, it tastes savory to us, but to people in the past, that kind of puddings would have this kind of sweet touch to them, which they absolutely loved. And humanity loves sweet things, and that's how puddings started to evolve from being savory dishes that we perceive as savory today to completely sweet dishes. But of course, the savory dishes, the savory puddings like black pudding and haggis and steak and kidney pudding, they still exist today as well. They coexist, but that's why people are often confused. They're like, puddings, okay, that's sweet. No, it's not all sweet. Puddings you can have an entire meal, starter, main, and dessert, and have it completely made out of puddings. It's not, when I say it's a pudding book, it's not a sweet book. It is everything.
I always urge people to get past whatever squeamishness they have about certain things, because black pudding is glorious. And so I do love steak and kidney pudding. I've only had it once, but it was wonderfully done and I really liked it. And also haggis is really, I found, underwhelming. It was nice and there was nothing remarkable about it. It was just a nice thing. If you didn't know what it was necessarily, I don't think you would have really cared. Anybody would have eaten it and just been like, okay, this is nice. And I can't imagine anybody being objectionable to anything with it. But people get so caught up in the idea of it that they are, oh, that's disgusting. I'm like, no, it's actually really good. There's nothing wrong with it at all. It's just, we eat meat. I mean, what do you think? We should just throw away certain bits? That's wasteful. I've butchered animals and it's so ridiculous to throw away so many bits like the heart and stuff because people are squeamish. That makes no sense to me.
No, exactly. We are so far removed from the animal and from food production in general that we have become really strangely squeamish about some things. I mean, I remember this story an Italian friend told me that in their village in the past, they would slaughter a pig, and then the kids would get the buckets of blood, the warm blood, and they would carry it to their mothers, who would mix it with melted chocolate. And then the kids were all like really eager to have a cup of chocolate milk. And they loved it. They weren't thinking about the fact that, oh my God, it's blood, it's evil. No, for them, it was rural. It was really normal. They had cared for this pig, and then it was slaughtered, and they were honoring it by using up every little bit of it, respecting that animal and what it gave them, and drinking the blood. For them, that was completely normal. But of course, if you are so far removed from the animal and you see them in styrofoam packets, then it creates this crazy relationship to food, which is of course an incredibly big problem today.
This episode is sponsored by Culinary Historians of Northern California, a Bay Area educational group dedicated to the study of food, drink, and culture in human history. To learn more about this organization and their work, please visit their website at www.chnorcal.org. I wanted to talk to you about the official Downton Abbey Christmas cookbook, which I really loved. I'm a fan of the show, and I just thought this was such a lovingly written book, and I just really enjoyed the way you handled the content. And I also thought, for people that are kind of history nerds like me, it's kind of also fun to see the commentary and additional information. How did you get a chance to write this book, and what was it like for you to write it?
So the question came, and I was really honored, of course. And they were really keen to have someone on board who would look at history and would really grasp the era of Downton Abbey and have the food really work with the TV show. But on the other hand, it is a Christmas cookbook, so it's Downton Abbey Christmas cookbook. And you can't fill an entire cookbook with historical Christmas recipes from just the era of Downton Abbey, because that's the thing. British people love Christmas, but they love traditions as well. So the food that was in the food that was popular for Christmas in medieval times is still the food that's popular for Christmas today. It's just changed that those dishes, for example, for Christmas pudding and Christmas cakes and goose, duck and roasted meats and all of that, things with lots of spices and lots of dried fruits in it, that was eaten at every special occasion. It was also eaten at Easter. It was also eaten at weddings, at coronations. But of course, at a certain time, we as humans always need to kind of link things to one occasion. And that's what happened with Christmas. And that's why today we associate like things like Christmas cake and Christmas pudding and all these things with lots of currants and lots of raisins and spices. We link that very much with Christmas. And so when I was doing the book, I also felt it was really necessary to actually tell people about that story of Christmas and about the evolution of Christmas recipes and festive recipes in Britain, and give them recipes from medieval times that aren't even made today anymore, or aren't even made during the Downton era, but are still very valid and tell a story of Christmas and Christmas feasting. And another interesting story that I tried to weave into the book, and I'm really glad that the publisher kept in, is that if you watched Downton Abbey, you know that there's this storyline with Lady Edith, who wants to be independent. She wants to be a journalist. She wants to be a columnist. She wants to write. She wants to own her own magazine. So she's really independent. And that was incredibly unusual for that time, when women just were supposed to be happy and shut up, basically, and be pretty. And she wanted to have her own life. And there are a couple of food writers, female food writers from the period of Downton Abbey, that I really wanted to highlight in the book. So I tried to choose, for the Downton era, I tried to choose recipes from the cookbooks of these women to give them a voice and to tell their stories. And I was able to tell a little bit about each of these women in the Downton Abbey Christmas cookbook, because it works so well with that theme of Lady Edith in Downton Abbey. And it gave me the opportunity to really put a light on these forgotten women and make us all realize that it was not something that was normal at that time for women to be food writers. It was exceptional, and we take it for granted today that we can almost do anything as women, but it wasn't like that even during the Downton era. So I wanted to highlight that, and it stayed in the book, and that makes the book, I think, very special, because it could have been just a book based on the TV series and nothing more than that. But instead of that, it's a book that tells us the history of Christmas feasting, and also the history of female food writers and how what situation was realistic for them during the era of Downton Abbey.
As a researcher and a lover of food history, what was it like doing the research for you? I mean, I think one of the things that Downton Abbey really highlights for me is the class differences and the way that people of different classes eat and the way they're able to get food. Was it thrilling for you to do the research for this book?
Yes, absolutely. And of course, I already knew a lot before I was doing the book. So it was basically focusing my research on the Christmas and also on the feasting and the female writers of that time. But history, I mean, ever since I was a small child, I've been obsessed with history books and looking in history books. So it made sense that I became a writer about food history. So it's always like a puzzle, really, isn't it? If you're starting a research, it's like a blank puzzle, and you need to, before you can actually put the puzzle together, you have to find the image that fits onto the puzzle, and that is an incredibly exciting journey to do. And I don't know, I mean, I find that I don't know if this answers your question.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I wanted to also ask you about another work that you published in 2020, the British Baking Book, The History of British Baking, Savory and Sweet. This is a magnificent book, and I really am just so thrilled with it. And I want to ask you about how you got a chance to write this and what it was like doing the research. And I also want to ask you about how you divided the book up into regions and how you got the idea to do that when you were writing it.
When I was starting the research for the British Baking Book, of course, it doesn't come through as much with the US title, the British Baking Book, as in the UK title of the book, which is called Oats from the North, Wheat from the South. Because if you look at British baking, you can clearly see that there's a lot of baking with oats. But if you look at where those recipe comes from, they all come from the north of the island rather than the south, because in the north they have much less sunshine. It's much more hardy, the weather, than in the south. So they can't grow wheat in the south. So they had to use more hardier grains than like oats. And in the south they could use wheat, of course, if they were wealthy enough, because fine wheat was always a privilege of the rich. And I thought that was really interesting. And also looking at climate and climate change today, to looking at the book from a way of the regions, not like saying we're looking at Cornwall or the Cotswolds or that. No, we're looking north and south. We're looking at basically where the boundaries, where the borders are, where it starts to become much more cold and wet, and where wheat doesn't grow anymore. And of course, that is all changing today again. So I thought it was interesting to look at it in that way. And that's why the title in English is called Oats in the North, Wheat from the South, to really show that difference. And for us here in Belgium as well, we have a big culture with rye bread, because wheat didn't grow very well here either, because we live very, in the Belgium and the Netherlands, we are sea climate. So we it's very wet and it's very windy, and the wheat that we have is very weak as well. And then mostly what we have is buckwheat, rye and barley. So it just goes to show that the baking culture can only evolve with the grains that are available, because people didn't travel before the railways came. It would only, before railway travel, you had to do with what was local. So that is why certain recipes appeared in certain localities, because that was all hyper local. It's actually like today we are looking at hyperlocal restaurants and short chain and everything like that, and it's all coming back because we kind of all realize that we can't keep on flying in certain products from the other side of the globe. We must see what we have in our own backyard and make do with that.
You have a very famous quote in the front of the book. It is, "Sugar has a cost, and that cost was paid by those held in bondage." This has been a very noted quote, and I love why you wrote it. Can we talk a bit about this?
Well, I find that we have to, especially as white people, privileged people, we have to really realize that for a baking culture to exist in the extent that we have it today, which is with using sugar, not just honey, which what it was in the medieval times, before there were imports and sugar plantations, that so we know that for a baking culture to exist, we have sugar, and that sugar was of course not harvested by white privileged people like we are. People were taking advantage of, their liberties were taken, and that is something that a lot of peoples today still feel, knowing that their ancestors were working on those plantations and were displaced because of the sugar trades and because of slavery. And I feel that that this is part of the story. This is part of history. We can't ban all our baking recipes. We can't do that, but we should acknowledge the fact that we can thank our baking culture to the people who have lost so much and have often lost their lives. And we should be grateful to these people and acknowledge that. And that's the least we can do. We should do so much more, but that's the least we can do, is acknowledge that. And that's why it's on the first page of the book, rather than in the back somewhere, you know, as a kind of disclaimer. For me, it had to be in the front of the book as the first thing you read, to kind of just realize, you know, this is important. We should all realize this. We should all know this and acknowledge this.
In 2022, you were part of the Platinum Pudding competition. Can you talk about this and tell our listeners who may not be familiar with it about it a little bit?
So when the Platinum Jubilee of the Queen of England was approaching, the very famous store Fortnum & Mason had the idea to have a pudding created for the celebrations, because of course we have coronation chicken in Britain, and they wanted to have some iconic pudding to go into history, which I thought was very exciting. And then I was asked to be a judge on that competition, because of course in Belgium, in my home country, I'm a judge on the Belgian version of the Great British Bake Off, or the Great British Baking, the Great Baking American Baking Competition, it's called, I think, in the US.
Yeah.
So I had, of course, 7 years of experience judging cakes and judging food before that. And of course, my knowledge of British food history came in handy for the judging process as well. And that was an exciting thing, because there were so many entries, so many people wanted to be part of that Jubilee pudding competition, because of course, so many people also understood that if their pudding would be chosen, if their recipe would be chosen, it would go down into history alongside that coronation chicken, and the name of the maker would go down in history. And I was almost a little bit jealous that I couldn't enter my pudding, because, you know, you would be so incredibly happy if your name would go down in history connected to something like that. So, I mean, Gemma, who won with a lemon trifle, she was absolutely so gobsmacked that she won. And so many people asked me, so it's a traditional trifle, that one? And we were all in agreement, all of the judges. So we had the royal chef, we had Mary Berry, for example, and all of us, as we tasted that lemon trifle, we all felt something. And for me, especially when the trifle was paraded into the room, I could see, like, this isn't very old traditional British dish pudding. It has its roots centuries ago. It has so much history. So it is exciting to see that come in, and to understand that someone thought that this was still relevant today, even though even a lot of British people think, oh, the trifle, it's so old-fashioned. But actually, if you parade it into the room in this big bowl with all the layers visible, it is quite stunning. And I think everyone felt it when they saw it. It was so perfect that everyone felt it. And then when we tasted it, we were blown off our socks, because everything was right. Every aspect of it was right. And it kind of reminded us that in this world today, when we have these incredibly talented chefs making these intricate desserts with all kinds of new and fancy techniques, that this humble thing like a trifle could still blow us off our shoes. We were all amazed by it. And I mean, I got teary-eyed because of it. And yeah, when we all had to put forward our two favorites, we all said the lemon trifle first. We were in agreement, all of us. And that was extraordinary. And now the trifle it has gone down in history as the platinum jubilee pudding, which I think is extraordinary, especially, you know, if you're a historian yourself, then you can understand that it's incredible that a dish that's centuries old has been given a new life, because since then magazines in Britain are starting to publish so much more trifle recipes. It got a little bit overlooked, it got a little bit forgotten about, but today trifle is back.
So I want to take you full circle and talk about your most recent book, Dark Rye and Honey Cake, Festival Baking from Belgium, the Heart of the Low Country. Can we talk about this book a bit, and how you were inspired to write it, and write about the baking of Belgium?
So Dark Rye and Honey Cake is the book that finished my way home. As I said before, when I wrote Belgian cafe culture, about the Belgian beer cafes, that was like my first steps looking at my own culture and looking at my home. And after the Belgian cafe culture was published, in my spare time I started doing the research for this book, and that took me 8 years, because of course I was doing other books along the way in my weekdays, let's say, because my life is not really weekdays and weekends. It's just kind of always. Yeah. There's no work-life balance whatsoever, because of course when I have some spare time I will do research for a next book, and that's what I did for years with Dark Rye and Honey Cake, because I have this vast collection of antique British cookery books. And 8 years ago, I was like, okay, I need to start paving the way home. So I started paving the way home with collecting antique Flemish and Dutch cookery books, and also German, French, to kind of just have an idea of my region, which is the Low Countries, and have an idea of how our food culture works. And then I started researching how our history interacts with the food and the cookery books. And the book is also quite political, in that it's called Festival Baking from Belgium, the Heart of the Low Countries, but in my own country the book is not called Belgium, the Heart of the Low Countries, it's just called the Heart of the Low Countries, because if we speak about Belgium has only existed since 1835. So it's a very recent country. So if I would be talking about the historical food of Belgium, then it would be a very thin book. And the Heart of the Low Countries is much more correct when it comes to talking about my region. But of course, that's very abstract for people abroad. That's why it's been added to the subtitle of the foreign editions, so people can understand that when they see Belgium, they kind of pinpoint, okay, yeah, we're talking about this country there, Belgium. And of course, there's so many people in the US who have Belgian ancestry as well, which makes it very interesting too. So the research took a long while in my spare time, and then 3 years ago I started working on it full time, and that was a very emotional path that I took, because for the first time I had to look at my own history here, the history of my country and how it came to be. And because what people don't realize about Belgium is that we are quite a segregated country. We have 3 language groups. So we have a region that speaks Dutch, Flemish, like I do, and a region that speaks French, and a region that speaks German. We all have our own parliament. So we kind of live next to one another, and then we have a federal parliament, and then nothing really works because they're all like arguing, and we have the situation where we hardly ever meet people from our own country who speak another language. So I don't have friends who are from Wallonia, which is a French spoken region of my country. We live really next to one another. And the politics of my country thinks that's really handy, because they keep us separated. Because if you divide, you rule. And they think that's really handy. And when I was doing the research of the book, I saw that we have so much more in common than I ever realized. Because of course, because we don't speak with each other. We don't know what we have in common. And then the best way to actually feel common ground is when we come together around the table and eat together and talk about our customs and realize that even though that there are things that divide us, like, of course, we don't even speak the same language, there are so many more things that unite us. And I think that's interesting because people abroad, they don't realize that we are not trilingual. We don't speak all three languages, everyone here. If you're from Wallonia, you speak French, and you usually do not speak Flemish or German. The Germans, they are usually trilingual because they're like Switzerland. It's really strange, but they want to speak all of our three languages, but it's just a tiny group in Belgium. And then, of course, Flemish people, they often speak French, but not very much, because I am ashamed to say that I don't speak French either. It's always been very difficult for me to learn French. I've had more affinity with Germanic languages, so I speak English and German. So it's for me, this book is also a bridge between our different language communities in Belgium. So it's, of course, published in Belgium too, and in the Netherlands, and I hope it brings people together so they can see that we have a common culture, and even people who have forgotten their culture, because so many of the recipes and customs in this book have been completely forgotten about by people in this country as well. And then, of course, it is very interesting to see that we have a community of Belgian people who are in the area of Wisconsin and Door County, and who are still keeping hold of Belgian culture, and they have Belgian pies. I spoke to Gina Good from the Flower Pots in Door County. She taught me how to make Belgian pies, and she told me about all the things that they make in their region, which they consider to be truly Belgian, and they are very different from what we actually have in Belgium, because, of course, they took the recipes to the US and they made those recipes with the ingredients that were common in the US and that are not common here. So it changed. Like, for example, the Belgian pies are made with this cottage cheese, but we don't use cottage cheese in Belgium at all. So it's very interesting to see that even though they are, they're keeping hold of Belgian recipes, the recipes are still different. They have evolved, and that's completely fine. But it is interesting to see how they actually try to keep hold of Belgian culture even harder than we try to keep hold of our culture in Belgium, because it's in Belgium we tend to kind of adopt other cultures, then we prefer to eat out and eat Italian or Chinese or Japanese or Moroccan, and we hardly have any restaurants left that serve actual Belgian cuisine, apart from some touristy restaurants, which is a terrible shame, because of course we do have lovely things, but that's the thing. If it's in front, the things that are in front of your nose are often the things that you forget about, strangely enough, because you take them for granted. So, for example, you have to search really hard for an actual tea room that still bakes the waffles like they were baked years ago. All those tea rooms are disappearing because people prefer to have donuts today.
What other foods are quintessentially Belgian that you talked about in the cookbook?
So we have, of course, our waffles, but many people didn't realize when they opened up the book, there are 14 recipes for waffles in the book. And they always assume that the Belgian waffle is just this one waffle, which is strange, because even in the US, you have like 2 different waffles that are considered the Belgian waffle. But we have, we have many more than one waffle or 2 waffles. We have so many more recipes for waffles. We have thin biscuit-like waffles. We've got waffles which are filled with a caramel. We've got thick Brussels waffles. We've got waffles that are especially made to keep in the pantry because they have a really long shelf life. So they're made for waffle sales, to raise money of them for schools and charity. And there's so many waffles. For every occasion, there's a waffle. There's a waffle for New Year. There's a waffle for Christmas. So it is very exciting to be able to share that waffle culture and set the record straight that there's not just one Belgian waffle. And another thing that is very special to my region, the heart of the Low Countries, but not exclusively Belgium, because we share, of course, a lot of our culture with the Netherlands and the border regions of France and Germany, because of course borders have changed over the centuries and food doesn't have any borders. So we have these vlaai, which are pies or tarts filled with fruit or rice pudding, and cheese as well. In Wallonia, in the French region of my country, they use a lot of fresh cheese in their pies, and those are very special to us because they used to be made in communal ovens, and people, the women mostly, they would walk there with these long shelves full of pies, and they would walk to the communal oven, and the pies would be baked. They would be baked for weddings, funerals, the village fairs, Easter. Every occasion those pies would be baked, and that's very iconic to my culture. And then of course we have this very special festive loaves, but sadly those loaves have been completely forgotten about. They are very big decorative loaves that you can spot in paintings of the 17th and 18th century, which are also depicted in my book, because I wanted to tell the story of the paintings of the periods, the still lives and the genre paintings of that period, which feature a lot of food. So I wanted to tell people about that food and show the sweets that we still have today, but also the sweets like the breads, the loaf of breads, who have disappeared. One other thing that's iconic is, of course, all of our recipes for honey cakes or gingerbreads. But of course, because ginger is not our main spice in our gingerbread, we don't call it gingerbread. We call it either speculoos or pepper cake or honey cake. So we have a whole chapter with those kinds of gingerbread types of cakes, which can sometimes be loaves, like almost bread-like. Sometimes they can be snappy biscuits. Sometimes they can be these like big rock biscuits, like they're very chewy. So there's basically like a speculoos or a gingerbread for every occasion, all the time that you have to put in it. Because of course, if you want to use a speculoos mold or a gingerbread mold to press, kind of print the biscuits, that takes a long while, but you can make them free form. And there's recipes that basically require you just to make the dough and then just press it onto a baking sheet and then break those parts, break the resulted cake into pieces. And then you have like big chunks of the gingerbread, which is fantastic. I used to buy one in our local bakery around school, and it would have like it in a paper bag, and it'd take me 3 days to finish because I was always like biting like tiny bites and then putting it back in the little paper bag and then having more the next day. What else is iconic? Yeah, of course, those things like letter biscuits, which appear in those still lives. Fritters, like for example, oliebollen, which are like basically the ancestor of your donuts before they got a hole in them. We got varieties of those as well, and we have a couple of pretzels as well, and then pancakes, of course, because every culture has pancakes, because it's logical, because you will of course have a pan and you will have a batter, and it can be easily made. But we make them from buckwheat as well, because of course buckwheat was much more common than wheat flour. Yeah, I mean, so many different recipes in the book, and also all very easy recipes. They are not complicated. They don't require you to make buttercream or any type of complicated technique. It's just read the recipe and then just do it and relax. It's just a very relaxing cookbook.
This sounds like all the foods of heaven. This sounds wonderful. I wanted to talk to you about another aspect of the book that I just really loved, and this carries over to some of the other works as well. And it is the beautiful artwork and just your design. I really got a feel that you love books, because there was a lot of love put into the visual aspects of the book. Can we talk about that a bit?
Yeah, of course, because of my background as a graphic designer, I look at creating my books maybe in a different way to another author. When I write my books, I have a very good relationship with my longtime publisher, Murdoch Books, and they understand the way I work. That for me, it's not just the words; it's visually everything it comes together. So we will create the cover. So my husband is the illustrator of all the illustrations in my books and the cover designs, and the interiors is what I design, because of course I need to work in those files. When I write, I do not write in Word or in Pages. I write into InDesign, which is the program that creates the books. So when I design the book, that's when I start writing it, and I can see the book completely come together while I write it. So when I have written a chapter, for example, that chapter is ready. That it's completely layouted, because I do the layout myself. I mean, I have an agreement with my publisher that I am, of course, paid for all of that work. But it's for me important to be able to do that, because if I have to write in Word, I lose interest in it, because it's just words. For me, that seeing the design, seeing the artwork that I'm talking about, seeing the photo of the cakes I'm writing about, it is very, very important to see all of that. I'm a very conceptual writer. For me, it's all or nothing, basically. Even when I was writing the Downton Abbey Christmas cookbook, I was, of course, not allowed to do the layout, because it was already designed. It was like the previous Downton Abbey cookbook written by Dr. Annie Gray, so it had to look the same. So I basically created a mock-up of the design, so I could write into the design anyway. So I could do that anyway, because otherwise I lose interest. I have dyslexia and I have ADHD,
As do I.
that is probably why I need that, because I just, when I'm reading a book, it's also a problem, because it's all like a lot of text and I lose interest. And when it comes to writing, it's the same thing. If I have to write in Word, then I'll get bored of it. And if I can write into the layout of my book, then I am excited about it, because I can see all of these different things. Even like I see the page number, I see the title, and it has a different color maybe, and you can see the photograph, and it excites me, because the book is completely taking shape while I'm writing it. And I think that's why maybe you pick up on it being so visual, and it working together with everything that you see and read in the book.
I think just seeing them, the spine out on the bookshelf with other books, they jump out at you. There's something that just calls to you, and it's really magical. And I just love seeing when people who are creative can get a chance to have a hand in how the book looks, because I think it's so very important.
Yeah. It is so important, because I mean, we really made sure that they started at the same height and everything. Like when you're talking about the spine, there's the white label with the title of the books, with all of my books, that it's the same height, it's the same font, it just completely matches. And that's, of course, something you can only do if you have the design of your books into your own hands. And I mean, I'm not going to say to everyone, just start designing your own books. You really do you do have to know what you're doing. But of course, I know what I'm doing. I've worked as a graphic designer for nearly 10 years. My husband's been working as an art director, illustrator, and graphic designer for over 20 years. So we actually know what we are doing. So I wouldn't recommend to everyone to just do that. I mean, also, you need to, everyone's got their talent. Everyone needs to do what they're talented at. And for me, it's just a different situation, because I have started my career as a graphic designer, and that's why this it's, for me, it's interesting to do this. But you need to know what you're doing, because if you mess it up, then it won't be good for your book either.
So what's next for you?
So what's next for me? I'm going on my American book tour in the middle of May. Yes. So
are you going to be in the Bay Area?
The Bay Area. Where is
like
that?
San Francisco?
Yeah, so I'm going to San Francisco. Indeed, I'm going to Omnivore Books at.
Oh, I know them. I'll be there.
Yeah.
I gotta see you. It's going to be great.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You must come. So I'm going to be at Omnivore Books on the 18th of May, and then I'm going to Seattle at Booklade the 20th of May, and then I'm going to be at Now Serving in LA on the 25th. So it's basically the East Coast that I'm doing, and I'm looking forward to also doing a West Coast part towards the winter. So yeah, and other than, of course, the book tour, I'm also working very hard on my next book proposal, which is still a big secret. Actually, I have 3 book proposals I'm working on. I'm always busy working on several books. You can't bet on one horse, but at the same time, you can't keep a creative mind into a box. And I have always so many ideas. So I'm really excited about which book it's going to become the next book. And I'm looking forward to seeing you hopefully in San Francisco at Omnivore Books.
Yeah, I really want. That's going to be great. I do want to be there and get my book signed. That'd be great.
Yeah.
I really love getting a chance to talk to you. Thank you so much for being on this podcast. It's been wonderful getting a chance to kind of pick your brain.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been great fun.
That was my conversation with historian, cookbook author Regula Ysewijn. We have links to her books and her website in the bio. You can check that out and purchase the books online through the links provided. Next week, we're going to be talking with Rinku Bhattacharya, who is a gourmet, award-winning cookbook author, blogger, and cooking instructor. I'm looking forward to having you listen to my conversation with Rinku. Until next week, I hope you're having a great week, possibly creating some recipes from some of the cookbook authors that I've interviewed. Until next week, keep on cooking.